This mini-lecture discusses how stoichiometry calculations can be used to predict how much of a product will form when we don't have enough of one of the reactants and whether any excess reactant will be left over. As we've seen previously, stoichiometry is a technique that uses the balanced chemical... This mini-lecture discusses how stoichiometry calculations can be used to predict how much of a product will form when we don't have enough of one of the reactants and whether any excess reactant will be left over. As we've seen previously, stoichiometry is a technique that uses the balanced chemical equation to determine the relative amounts of reactants and products involved in a reaction. Much like how a recipe allows us to determine how much of each ingredient is needed if we want to scale a recipe up or down. Here we have a recipe for a chocolate cake that requires a specific amount of each ingredient to make a 2-layer chocolate cake. A chemical reaction tells us how many reactants we need to make a certain amount of products. But what if you go to make your chocolate cake and you gather your ingredients and you realize you only have 2 eggs? Since the recipe calls for 4 eggs, but you only have half of the required amount, then you can only make 1 layer of the chocolate cake. As chemists, we say you are limited by the number of eggs you have. You still have enough ingredients to make a chocolate cake, but you will need to scale back all of the other ingredients by half and only make half of the chocolate cake recipe. This same sort of thing happens in chemical reactions. Often one reactant is in limited supply and it therefore limits the amount of product that can be formed. This reactant is called the limiting reactant, and it is the only reactant that will be completely used up in the reaction. Other reactants may be left over if an excess amount is present. Just like how in our cake recipe, there will be leftovers of all the other ingredients except the eggs, because we had enough of our other ingredients to make a 2-layer cake, but since we are now only making a 1-layer cake, we have an excess amount of those ingredients. In this reaction between nitrogen gas and hydrogen gas, 3 molecules of hydrogen are required for every 1 molecule of nitrogen. The nitrogen molecules are shown as large, darker blue molecules, and the hydrogen molecules are shown as smaller, light blue molecules. The 3 clusters of molecules that are enclosed by these dashed line circles represent the stoichiometric amounts of these reactants that will combine to create products. So 3 hydrogen molecules and 1 nitrogen molecule inside each of these clusters. We can already tell that there isn't enough light blue hydrogen to react all of the dark blue nitrogen. So 6 molecules of the product NH3 are produced, but 2 molecules of nitrogen are left over. So we say that hydrogen is the limiting reactant as it limits the production of NH3 to only 6 molecules. Even though there was enough nitrogen to form more than 6 molecules of NH3, the limiting reactant was used up, and the last 2 molecules of nitrogen were left without any hydrogen remaining to react with. Therefore, since there is nitrogen left over, we call the nitrogen the excess reactant. Moving forward, we won't have pictures to rely on for determining the limiting and excess reactants, but we will have the balanced chemical reaction. It's important to remember that the balanced chemical reaction tells us what happens on the particulate level, and therefore it can be scaled up to moles. So when determining the limiting reactant in a reaction, we want to compare the number of moles provided of each reactant to the amount that is needed in the balanced chemical reaction. Mole ratios given by the balanced chemical reaction will be crucial in these calculations, as it is not simply enough to determine the reactant for which you have the fewest moles. There are 2 main approaches that I demonstrate for students for how to solve limiting reactant problems. Either of these approaches will work just fine for every problem you encounter, but one approach might take fewer steps to determine the answer depending on the type of question the problem is asking. So, it can be beneficial to learn both approaches if you want to work efficiently. However, if one of these approaches makes more sense to you than the other, then just stick with learning one approach. The first approach is called the least reactant method, and it involves calculating the amount of one reactant that is needed to fully react another reactant. We then compare the amount of reactant that is needed to the amount that is provided, and the reactant that is in short supply will be your limiting reactant. Now for an example. First, note that it is crucial to begin with a balanced chemical reaction. Always check that the reaction in the problem is balanced before you proceed to stoichiometric calculations. Note that this problem is asking us to solve for the amount of hydrogen gas produced when equal amounts of aluminum and HCl are provided. To solve for the amount of product, we must first determine the limiting reactant. This is because the limiting reactant will limit the amount of product that can be formed. So we will want to use the amount of limiting reactant to eventually calculate the amount of product that is produced. With the least reactant method, we begin by randomly choosing a reactant. Let's pick HCl. We then ask ourselves how much aluminum is needed to fully react all 5 moles of HCl. We can calculate this using stoichiometry and the mole ratio between aluminum and HCl in the balanced reaction. So 5 moles of HCl times the mole ratio of 2 moles of aluminum per 6 moles of HCl equals 1.67 moles of aluminum. That is needed to fully react all 5 moles of HCl. Since the problem states that we are provided with 5 moles of aluminum, then we know we have plenty of aluminum to react all of the HCl. In fact, we can solve for the amount of aluminum that would be left over by simply subtracting the amount that is needed from the amount that is provided, and see that 3.33 moles of aluminum will be left over. So, aluminum is our excess reactant, and HCl is probably our limiting reactant, because we have enough aluminum to fully react all 5 moles of the HCl, at which point the reaction will stop because we will run out of HCl. Therefore, the reaction is limited by the HCl. However, we can double check that this makes sense by doing a second calculation, where we now ask ourselves, how much HCl is needed to fully react all 5 moles of the aluminum? So, using stoichiometry and the mole ratio, 5 moles of aluminum times the mole ratio of 6 moles of HCl per 2 moles of aluminum equals 15 moles of HCl that is needed to fully react all 5 moles of aluminum. Since the problem states that we are provided with 5 moles of HCl, then we know we don't have enough HCl to react all of the aluminum. Therefore, the HCl will be completely used up, limiting the production of products as the reaction cannot proceed with only aluminum after the HCl has run out. And we expect there will be some aluminum left over. So, this second calculation confirms that the HCl is the limiting reactant and the aluminum is the excess reactant, and it may have been the first calculation if you had chosen to do this one first instead of the one that we did choose to do first. Note that either of these calculations arrives at the same conclusion for identifying the limiting and excess reactants, but only the first calculation allows us to calculate how much of the excess reactant is left over. So if this had been part of what the problem was asking for, you may need to do both calculations. But in this case, since all we care about is the amount of product being formed, then we only need to do one of these calculations in order to identify the limiting reactant, so that we can now move on to calculating the amount of product. Now that we know that the limiting reactant is HCl, we can use the amount of HCl provided to calculate how much product is formed. This final calculation looks very similar to the previous two, except a different mole ratio is used this time. The final calculation shows that 2.5 moles of hydrogen will be produced from the complete reaction of all 5 moles of the limiting reactant, HCl. Note that this value can also be calculated using the amount of excess reactant that is needed, but you would get the wrong amount if you use the amount of excess reactant that is provided, as not all of the excess reactant is used to make product. The next approach is called the least product method, and it involves calculating the amount of a product that would be formed if a reactant is completely used up. We do this for both reactants and then compare the predicted amounts of product. This approach basically has you assume that both reactants are the limiting reactant. However, the true limiting reactant will always produce the least amount of product. So the calculation that yields the smallest amount of product indicates your limiting reactant. Note that the excess reactant would be able to form more product if there was enough of both reactants to fully react all of the excess reactant. And since these calculations start off by assuming that both reactants fully react, we need to keep in mind that we know there is a possibility that one of them will be a limiting reactant while an excess amount of the other is provided. I'll use the same problem so that we can compare the work needed for both methods. With the least product method, we'll start by assuming one of the reactants is the limiting reactant. Let's say aluminum and calculate how much hydrogen would be formed if all 5 moles of the aluminum reacts to form products. We then use stoichiometry and the mole ratio to determine that 7.5 moles of hydrogen will be produced if all 5 moles of the aluminum reacts. In this method, the first calculation is not enough to make any conclusions about the limiting reactant. We must do the same calculation with the other reactant and then compare the results in order to determine the limiting reactant. So next we assume that HCl is the limiting reactant and calculate how much hydrogen would be formed if all 5 moles of the HCl reacts to form products. Again, we use stoichiometry and the mole ratio to determine that 2.5 moles of hydrogen will be produced if all 5 moles of the HCl reacts. Now we can compare the predicted amounts of product to see that fully reacting HCl produces less hydrogen than fully reacting aluminum. So once 2.5 moles of hydrogen is produced, there won't be any HCl remaining to react with the rest of the aluminum. And so even though we have enough aluminum to produce 7.5 moles of hydrogen, we'll run out of HCl before we can react all of the aluminum. Therefore, HCl is the limiting reactant and the correct amount of hydrogen produced is the 2.5 moles. Note that with the least product method, by solving for the limiting reactant, you automatically solve for the amount of product that is produced, which is what this problem was asking for. We saw that the least reactant method that we did previously would also require at least 2 calculations, but we also did a third calculation to confirm the limiting reactant. So the least reactant method could take a little more time for this type of problem if you were being very thorough in your approach. However, note that the least product method shown here does not give any information about the amount of excess reactant that is used in this reaction, and therefore we cannot use the values we calculated to quickly determine how much excess reactant is left over. So this is where the least reactant method that I showed before would be preferred, as we were able to calculate how much excess reactant was left over when using the least reactant method. So hopefully you can see that either of these methods gets us the correct answer for this problem, but that one of these methods may be preferred over the other depending on whether you are asked to solve for an amount of product that is being formed or an amount of excess reactant that is used or left over, or both of those questions. This concludes the second mini lecture for material from Chapter 9. Please note any questions you may have about this material and how it is utilized to solve problems in the suggested end of chapter exercises and the sapling homework for this chapter. Please post any urgent questions on Piazza. I will also take questions on this material during one of our required class meetings, and during that time we will focus more on problem solving for concepts in this chapter.